Hey, get rhythm. When you get the blues, come on, get rhythm. When you get the blues.
My grandparents were born in Kerrville, Texas, and grew up there in the 1940s and 50s. After high school, they moved to Houston, where my grandfather studied engineering at Rice University. They stayed in Houston to raise their two daughters. This documentary will tell of how they experienced the historical events of the 20th century through their own eyes. I asked my grandmother to name the historical event that stood out to her the most from every decade through the year 2000. For the 1940s, she said Pearl Harbor. For the 1950s, the Korean War. For the 1960s, President Kennedy's assassination. For the 1970s, America's 200th anniversary. For the 1980s, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And for the 1990s, the Oklahoma City bombing. I also asked my grandfather which historical event stood out the most to him from every decade of his life until the year 2000, but some of his answers were different. For the 1940s, he also said Pearl Harbor, and for the 1950s, he also said the Korean War. But for the 1960s, what he remembered most was the Vietnam War. For the 1970s, he remembered abandoning the South Vietnamese to invasion. For the 1980s, he talked about remembering a rebirth of American spirit. And for the 1990s, what he remembered most was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I had more questions for my grandparents, though, like which of these historical events that they experienced impacted them the most. Here's what they said. But I wanted to know more about how the historical events of the 20th century were experienced, so I asked my grandparents if there are any instances of history that they experienced being recorded differently than they felt it had occurred. Next, I asked my grandparents to tell me about smaller, more personal events from their lives that they felt exemplified the cultural and political climate of that time. Then I asked my grandparents if there are any historical events that they thought would go down in history, but appear to have been forgotten about today. Next, my grandparents talked more about their own family's response to World War II. As terrifying as World War II seems to have been, it wasn't the answer my grandfather gave me when I asked him what the scariest historical event he lived through was. His answer to this question was probably related to his answer to my question of what the most important history-related lesson that he learned was. My grandparents learned many more lessons growing up, but many of the most important ones they seem to have learned from their family rather than history as it happened to them.